Hello, everyone.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's King's Talk on art history. My name is Greg Hunter and I am the Deputy Head Co-Curricular here at King's. And tonight we are privileged to welcome back OKS Tatyana Serraino and her talk entitled Why Art History? The Art of Deciphering. Tatyana left King's in 2015 and completed her BA from the University of Cambridge. She is an art historian and vlogger running her own YouTube and blog entitled AboutArt, as you just saw before in the video. She lives in Rome, works as a tour guide, is preparing to complete a Ph.D. or start a Ph.D. on Armenian art. She has a vision to make art accessible to a new and wider audience. So at any time, please type your question into the Q&A function as part of Zoom, or alternatively after Tatyana's presentation, please put your virtual hand up and we can put you on the air live to ask the question yourself. Now it is with great pleasure that I introduce Tatyana. Welcome, Tatyana.
Hi, thank you very much. It's great to be back.
Thanks, Tatyana. Look, before you start your presentation, can you please tell us all about your memories of King's and what happened next in your life after that?
Okay, well, I have really wonderful memories from King's. I made such amazing friends who are still my very close friends to this day. I had the opportunity to learn from really great teachers who really did significantly impact the way that I think. I had a wonderful house mistress as well who made Bailey my home for 2 years. So I entered to do my sixth form at King's. But what I remember most vividly, I think, was the atmosphere at King's and the really special feeling of being part of a really wonderful community, which I will take with me for the rest of my life. I was in school in Cyprus prior to coming to King's, and I just remember the first few weeks being in this whirlpool of opportunity and realizing that King's had so much to offer me, not just academically, but in so many other ways. So after King's, as you very rightly said, I studied art history at the University of Cambridge. I was at St. John's College for 3 years. And then after that, I decided to do a master's, once again in art history, in Rome, in Italy, where I currently am. And that was at the University of John Cabot in the heart of Rome. And then since then, I've stayed in Rome. I'm currently working as a content writer, a tour guide. I'm also an art consultant on the side as well for a company called Artvine. And then, as you said as well, I'm also trying to run my own YouTube channel in which I do short vlogs, so short, fast-paced videos on works of art from all over the world, with the aim of making art more accessible and hopefully providing people with a fresh twist on works of art from all over the world.
That's great, Tatyana. Thanks for that introduction. Exciting. So can we have, would you like to do your presentation now?
Yes, sure. Sounds good. So can I share my screen? Is that?
Yeah, please go for it.
All right, here we go. So here's just a starter slide. So what I thought I would do today is just talk to you about how I got into art history. And I would also love to unpack what art history is or what it means to be an art historian as well. Sometimes when I tell people that I am an art historian, they tend to say something like, wow, but then they're maybe unsure about what to ask, or they might say something like, well, do you paint as well? And while, you know, you can absolutely be an art historian who also enjoys painting and sculpting and drawing, it's so much more than that. What we do as art historians and what art history is essentially the art of deciphering works of art from all periods of time and discussing their meaning, their function, their impact, their style, and their power as well. So my love for art history was actually born at King's. I entered at the age of 16, and like everybody else, I was trying to choose my A-levels. And I remember seeing art history as one of the options, but I had no idea what it would entail. but I went for it anyway. And from the very first class, I fell in love with the subject. I had two wonderful teachers, David Felton and Diana Francis, and we would have our lessons in the beautiful art history attic at King's with these beautiful sloping ceilings. I know some of you know what I'm talking about. In that attic, we would just look at works of art and discuss them. And one discussion would lead us to talk about a specific painter or a particular time in history, or we would segue to another painting. And what I quickly began to realize is that art history as a subject comprises such a wide range of skills, ways of thinking, and also areas of study. It involves art, psychology, history, politics, theory, and philosophy. It requires you to look very closely, to think, to discuss, to research, and finally to be able to write or present a case about a work of art. So it demands a lot of skills, a lot of different areas of study. I also personally love storytelling in all its formats, and each painting I essentially see as a visual narrative. And part of what we study as art historians is the different ways in which artists have chosen to tell stories over the years. And this is where I'm going to start showing you some works of art just to sort of build my case. And these are some of my favorite works of art that I've talked about over the years. You might see them as well on my channel. So first of all, this one here, Apollo and Daphne by an artist called Gian Lorenzo Bernini. He is one of my favorite artists. He is a Baroque sculptor who operated in Rome. He liked to tell stories using different angles and using sculptures that demand a very active participation from us, the viewer. So what he does is he tempts us, he forces us to encircle his sculptures in order to understand the full narrative. So the narrative almost sort of unfolds as you walk around the sculpture. This sculpture, it talks about Apollo and Daphne, which is a mythological story. It's recounted in Ovid's Metamorphosis. And the story is that one day, the god Apollo, he upsets Cupid, the god of love. So as punishment, Cupid causes Apollo to fall in love with Daphne, a nymph, and he also causes Daphne to repulse Apollo, okay? So we have unrequited love happening. So Apollo is constantly chasing Daphne, as you can see here. And the moment in which he gets very close to her, Daphne, in disgust and in fear, she calls upon her father, a god, who turns her into a laurel tree to save her. Now, I want to show you how Bernini tells this story. I've got a very quick video here, but you'll see as we move around the sculpture, different aspects of the narrative are revealed. So you start off by seeing Daphne being chased by Apollo. And then as you move around, it turns into Apollo chasing Daphne, and you can see how aggressively he's sort of leaning forward and chasing after her. And then as you further make your way around the sculpture, you see the actual transformation in itself, right? We see Daphne transforming into this laurel tree. So it really does unfold. And if you see the sculpture from only one particular angle, you're not getting the full story. So it's an incredibly interactive way of telling a narrative. And I'll just show you a couple of close-ups just to show you how incredible this sculpture is. Bernini was such a master at creating texture. The first image on the left, you can see Daphne's toes transforming into roots, which I think is really cool. The middle picture, you can see her fingers transforming into leaves. And then the final picture on the right, you can see that her body is starting to become engulfed by this tree bark, the laurel tree. And notice that Apollo's hand is on her stomach, but it doesn't touch her skin, it only touches the bark. And this is showing that he never manages to sort of reach his lover, right? I mean, they're forever going to be separated by the bark and the laurel leaves, which is part of the tragedy of the story. So Bernini really brought it to life. But other artists have chosen different ways of telling a narrative. So here I have a very famous mural by Leonardo da Vinci himself. This is The Last Supper. If you ever have the chance to go and see this in person, go. This was one of the works of art that truly made me gasp when I first saw it. So what we have here is Jesus and his disciples, and they're sitting at a long table. They're having the Last Supper. And Da Vinci has shown the precise moment in which Jesus has just announced that one of his disciples will betray him. And what you can see are all 12 disciples reacting in very different ways. So they're all expressing or embodying a different emotion, right? And you can see that they're also all embodying these different gestures to get those emotions across. Now, what Da Vinci does, which is wonderful in this painting, is not only does he show this very momentary second, this momentary reaction, but he also foreshadows future events to come. So he's using one painting to hint to future, past, and present events. And one part of the painting that I want to point out in particular is this part here. You'll notice that Judas, who's leaning backwards away from Christ, he reaches forwards towards a bowl, and Christ is also reaching towards that same bowl. Now, this single detail, I think I've got a close-up for you. There we go. We've got both of their hands are open and almost touching the bowl. This single detail foreshadows the fact that Judas is the one to betray Christ. He's going to be the betrayer, because the way that Christ knows who his betrayer is that he drinks from the same bowl that he does. So Da Vinci is very cleverly inserting this minor detail there. And if you know the theology behind it, you would have been able to pick up on that detail and, fast forward through the narrative yourself. But Da Vinci is allowing you to do that through his painting. Another fun detail as well. So on the right of Jesus Christ, you've got Thomas, one of his disciples. He's pointing upwards to the ceiling with his right hand, second finger, and he's almost saying, is this part of God's plan? Well, this is a great, gesture in this very moment, but it also foreshadows the fact that this very same saint, Thomas, he's a little bit doubtful when Christ is resurrected, and one way to test whether it is actually Christ is he inserts his finger in Christ's ribcage, and it's the very same finger that he uses, right? So Da Vinci once again is using a very particular and specific detail to not only tell the story of the present, but also to take us ahead of time, to foreshadow the future. So wonderful little details, which you might not have noticed in the Last Supper, but it shows you how Da Vinci was thinking about telling his narrative. Something similar is happening with this painting. This is one of my favorite paintings. It's called Madonna of the Long Neck, because she has quite a long, elegant neck. Here, the artist Parmigianino, he's foreshadowing Christ's crucifixion. How does he do that? Well, you'll have to look pretty closely in this case, but on the urn that the angel is holding, you'll notice that there is a crucifix being reflected. Can we all see that? So that is a very sort of creepy and ominous hint towards Christ's impending future. I absolutely love this, and you won't maybe notice it when you first look at the painting, but upon further study, it's super creepy. I just love it so much. And this is showing you once again how Parmigianino is sort of fast forwarding throughout time to tell you not only the narrative of the painting, but narrative more broadly outside of the work of art itself. Then let's fast forward in time. Let's move on to a more modern work of art. This is Walking Man 2, a sculpture by Alberto Giacometti, who was a Swiss-Italian artist. Here, he's telling a story through texture, right? Through the actual appearance of the work of art. What we have is a single man striding forward. Now, one thing to point out is that Giacometti was very much influenced by Egyptian art. And one interpretation that I sort of gathered from looking at this work of art is that the actual stance is derived from Egyptian art. So you can see there's an Egyptian sculpture there. We can see a figure standing upright, and he's moving forward in the same way as the Giacometti figure is. But what Giacometti has done in this case is he's changed the texture. All right, we have this emaciated, weakened, defeated skeletal structure before us, which is great contradiction to this powerful Egyptian-looking sculpture. So what does that very specific texture do? Well, it brings up different feelings. Rather than bringing up feelings of grandeur, of strength, it brings up feelings of isolation or defeat or lack of power. And in actual fact, you can actually compare it to another Egyptian work of art, completely paradoxical, a mummy. Right? The texture is more similar to an Egyptian mummy as it is to an Egyptian powerful sculpture of an Egyptian god or something. So Giacometti is very deliberately doing this in order to perhaps give us a message on the futility of human experience, right? Or we have this man who's trying to stride forward, but at the same time, he's being held back by his own weakness or his own spindly arms, and we can't even make out his face properly. So that's another way you could possibly tell a story. So just from showing you these different works of art, I just wanted to give you a sense of the very different ways in which artists have chosen to tell stories over the years. And the ways in which they do tells you a lot about them as individuals, as individual artists. It tells you about their mindsets, but it also shows you how art functions in different times, in different periods of history, and how art can change in line with historical context. So Giacometti himself, the artist who created the sculpture, he experienced World War II. right? He was living through it. And one major interpretation has been that these figures are meant to portray the suffering of those who were sent to concentration camps, right? So you can see how experience, how mindset, how, you know, one's outlook on life can greatly have an impact on the way they tell a story, on the way they choose to make art and present it to us. All right, so from that very quick intro, I would like to tell you how I sort of talk about art history, how I like to describe it. My personal definition, if you will, is essentially the study of humanity through visual stories, right? That's how I like to describe art history. I think that encapsulates at least a good extent of it. And then what does it mean to actually be an art historian, right? Well, I love to compare art historians to detectives. I think that we're very similar in that sense. If you think of Sherlock Holmes or other famous detectives, they go on this process of deciphering and uncovering details. So what we do as art historians is we start off with what is a visual puzzle, right? It might be a painting, it might be a sculpture. And then slowly what we do is we decipher and we uncover as much about the painting or sculpture as we can, looking for its meaning, its date of execution, who painted it, who they were inspired by, how they were being different, or whether they were following a certain visual tradition and why. Now we do all this deciphering using clues. Now, these clues might be very concrete. It might be a written source from the artists themselves. It might be a sketch made by the artist or their workshop. It could even be a written contract, right, which has the actual date of the work of art. But sometimes, well, most of the time, we have to do a lot more of the digging ourselves. And we have to look at, for example, other works by the artist or other similar works of art from the same period, in order to try and figure out the painting. So it can get quite difficult, but that's where the fun is, okay? Because you start off having no idea what you're going to come across. And to give you a sense of what this process of deciphering can lead to, what it's like, how complex it can get, I would love to take you through the painting that I studied for my master's while I was here in Rome, just to give you a sense of what it might look like to be an art historian. So here we go. So this was the painting that I looked at. I looked at a single work of art. It's a painting that was executed by an artist called Jacopo da Pontormo. All right, but it's based on a now lost cartoon by Michelangelo himself. So on the right, you can see a cartoon, a sketch, which was made after Michelangelo's original cartoon. But the actual painting was executed by, you know, Michelangelo's contemporary Pontormo. So what I did is I treated the painting as Michelangelo's design, right? Everything in this painting is from Michelangelo. Pontormo was just the one who executed it. Now, what I was very particularly interested about in this painting, what the focus of my whole one-year master's study was the two masks that you see on the left of the painting. So the title of my thesis was The Unseeing Masks, the meaning of the two masks in Michelangelo Buonarroti's Venus and Cupid. This is a 16th century Florentine painting. And I should tell you that this painting, we know from a written source that it was meant to be seen alongside paintings of Florentine poets, okay? People like Dante and Petrarch and Boccaccio. Now, this was my first clue. I thought, you know, if this painting is being depicted alongside paintings of Florentine poets, of Tuscan poets, it's very likely that the painting is maybe commenting on or presenting certain poetic ideas that they were writing about, right? So that was my initial clue. This is just a close-up to show you the two masks that I was interested in deciphering. I think they're really, really fun to just look at. They're very, very expressive, very lifelike. And you have two that are very, very different in appearance. The one on top is more like a satire, and the one underneath is more passive, right? So I was also wondering, why on earth would you have these two opposing masks? What do their expressions mean? So as I said, the first clue was to look at poetry. And I knew this was a very important motif because after Michelangelo, other artists started to copy this motif. So you'll see on the right, we have a painting by Bronzino called The Allegory of Love. This is in the National Gallery in London, by the way, so you might have seen it. You'll notice in the bottom corner, we have three masks. It may look like two, but there's also a third one buried underneath the satyr mask, okay? So Bronzino is building off of the motif that Michelangelo introduced, all right? So Michelangelo was the first guy to put these two masks in the context of a painting with Venus and Cupid. So the woman there is Venus, and the little child, that's actually her son Cupid, and they're sort of having this very incestuous and perhaps disturbing kiss. So as I was saying, my first clue was Florentine poetry. So what I did is I went through hundreds of books in Italian looking for anything I could find to do with masks, right? And I found that it was, very present in the work of Dante and Petrarch and Boccaccio. They all brought up masks in the context of love, all right? So masks, or larva, that was the word that was being used. Larva both meant masks, like a literal mask, but it also meant more of a concept of death or transience or something ephemeral, right? So the word larva was being used both as a literal mask and more to describe the transient nature of love. So that was my first clue. Then what I did is I looked at masks in the work of Michelangelo to see if I could maybe find a connection. I did find masks, but they're not presented together with Venus and Cupid. So it was a little bit hard for me to use this in my thesis. All right. So I did take into account these two works. These are both by Michelangelo. You'll notice in both cases there are masks present, but at the same time, I just sort of put them to the side for now. Then what I found is that in Florence at the same time, and over Italy more widely, masks were being used in painting sometimes to represent vice and virtue. Okay, so on the left, we have a portrait of somebody called Aretino. You can see that his hand is placed over the more passive mask. That mask represents virtue, and the one next to it represents vice. And something similar is happening on the painting to the right. So lots of ideas were starting to come up. Are they representing vice and virtue? Are they representing, the bad and the good side of love? Then what I did is I looked at the satyr mask more closely, and I found that satires, they appeared in paintings. They were usually presented as these very lustful creatures who led to vice, bad behavior, building on these ideas again. Here you can see, for example, two satires sort of looking over a sleeping couple, the idea of observing or ogling, right, a sleeping couple. This is a painting by Mantegna that Michelangelo surely would have seen. And then what I discovered just by chance, this shows you just where art history can lead you. You'll notice that beneath the two masks, there's this ominous dead-looking body, right, in this altar-like shape. And by chance, I came across this other painting to the right, which shows pretty much the same thing. You have a dead body laying underneath a dangling mask. And this is where things really started getting interesting. And this was my chance to really dig deeper. And I thought maybe the masks have something to do with death as well. So I found even more paintings with the same kind of imagery, right? Dead bodies together with a mask. And I was really, getting intrigued. And then what I managed to find is that I had some sort of base for the satyr-like mask. I knew that it was based on satyrs, but the one underneath is more passive. And I found a mask that looked pretty much exactly the same, coming from a few years prior to Michelangelo's painting. And this mask, what it was, is essentially a cover for the painting on the right. And this passive mask was seen as a symbol of death. So the woman to the right, this was actually a posthumous painting. She was deceased at the time that this was executed, and they placed the mask on top of it to sort of show that she was deceased. So we definitely have death coming up and associated with the mask. These are some Flemish, so Northern European paintings from the 17th century, which again are bringing up the same idea. We have these vanitas paintings commenting on the sort of, the futility of life, the impending death. And in each case, you have a very impassive mask being presented as well. So I knew that there was something concrete here, that masks had something to do with death and also perhaps with vice and lust. And then one more thing which sort of confirmed this theory regarding death. In Florence in the 15th century, in the Renaissance, more broadly speaking, you'd be surprised to know that people were actually making death masks of themselves as a way to preserve their features and then allow them to be commemorated later on. So the person on the right was a very important patron, Lorenzo de' Medici. He actually brought up Michelangelo in a sense. He trained Michelangelo in his home. That is a wax sort of cast of his actual face. All right, so it's a really creepy way of preserving one's face. And on the right, we have Brunelleschi as well. So we can see that their features are really, really, carefully preserved in this weird mask. So this again, confirmed the idea that we had death going on with masks as well. So anyway, just to show you that I went down this crazy rabbit hole. So many sources came up, and that's what it's like to be an art historian. You start off with a painting like this, you have no idea where it's going to lead to, and then you come across all these different sources. And in the end, I had such a big conclusion. I was like, there's definitely something going on with death here. Perhaps these two masks are representing the lustful side of love, and more broadly speaking, the consequences of love as it was seen in Florence in the 15th century, which is inevitably death, all right? Because, they were thinking that, syphilis as well had a big part in this. So anyway, just a little quick insight into what it's like to be an art historian. To conclude this quite long talk of mine, just a couple of minutes more, I wanted to talk to you about a few paintings just to show you perhaps how you can think of art in a different way, or how you can look closely at art. So this is one of my favorite paintings. This is by an artist called Clara Peters. She was operating in the 17th century. Just looking at this artist at this work of art at first glance, you might think that it's just a regular still life painting, right? You can just see a few objects represented very carefully. But on closer looking, if you look quite closely, you'll notice that the jug on the right has something very interesting going on. I'm going to show you a close-up. There we go. So the jug is reflecting Clara Peters herself. So she has included self-portraits of herself in this painting. You'll notice that she's reflected in the circular parts of the jug. And in each case, she's shown with paintbrushes and a palette. So she's showing herself in the act of painting. And this, of course, completely breaks the fourth wall, as you might say, and it allows us to experience the painting in a completely different way. We can visualize Clara herself painting and executing this, as opposed to only seeing the finished product. And she does something similar with this one as well. So again, it looks like a still life, but then upon closer inspection, there we go. She's reflected in the jug, very carefully sort of distorted in line with the object's curve. I think this is wonderful. This really teaches you to look closely, not only when it comes to art, but in all areas of your life, right? That's a really great skill that art history tends to teach you. And then just, another few ways you can think about art or maybe appreciate the power and the impact of art. This is one of my favorite churches here in Rome. When I do tours, I tend to take people to this church and they're always shocked. Inside, there's a very special work of art. So this is a Baroque church. It was meant, like all important churches in Rome, to have this magnificent dome at the top. But as you can see, there is no dome, and that's because they ran out of money in 1642. So to make up for the fact that they ran out of money, they had their main painter execute a fake illusionistic dome on the interior ceiling of the church. And this is what it looks like. So that black dome that you can see on the interior, that is a flat wall that is being painted to look as if it's a concave dome. So the illusion of space, the illusion of it being absolutely concave and curved, there being this curve to it, that's all through paint, which is absolutely incredible. It still tricks people to this day. So a lot of people inside the church, they don't even tend to realize that this is a work of art. They just think that it's a real dome. So this is perhaps just to make you think about the power of art and its ability to fool us. So if you're ever in Rome, check this out. And there, more closely, you can see that it's actually a painting. But it's hard to envision that this is just a flat wall. It's, it's all through paint that the illusion is working. All right, two more works. This one is Marina Abramovic. She's a very famous artist. This can perhaps make you think about the power and perhaps the danger of art, right? It can provoke thought, it can shock us. What she did was in about 1974, I believe, she hosted a very particular and scary performance art. She sat for 6 hours in a room, and on a table beside her, she laid out 72 objects. They were mundane things like feathers, olive oil, a camera, but more dangerous things as well, like including a gun with loaded bullets. And she just let the audience have free rein. They were able to do anything they wanted to do to her during those 6 hours. And people started off pretty mild. So one person took a feather and maybe just tickled her head. But over time, people got much more dangerous with it. They were taking advantage of this power. They were sort of, feeding off of this power that they had. And they ended up almost terrorizing Abramovic. So somebody pointed the gun to her chest. We have a quote from her saying, I was ready to die in that moment. She got a cut on her face as well. People were really sort of pushing their boundaries. So this could perhaps make you think about the power of art and its ability to reflect us as humans and our actions and our capabilities. Something to think about. Abramovic is great in that sense. I mean, she hosts really challenging performance art to sort of challenge this idea. And finally, one more work of art. This is a sculpture in Rome that was unearthed in the 15th century. It's an ancient sculpture, but it was discovered, as I said, in the 15th century quite recently. He is known as Pasquino, so he has a name, and he is known as one of the 6 talking sculptures of Rome. So he's considered to speak to the people. And what do I mean by that? Well, during the 15th century, this tradition arose. Anytime people were sort of upset with something that the popes were doing or the government were doing, they would write these anonymous notes and affix them to the base of certain statues as if they were speaking on their behalf. And that's what you can see happening here with Pasquino. It's still a tradition that is very much alive today. So people in Rome, they'll go and attach a note to the base of the sculpture. And they feel as if the sculpture is talking on their behalf. So this is really showing you how art can function and how their function can change over time. When this was first made in antiquity, it was just a sculpture that perhaps depicted a mythological figure. We think it was either a Greek hero or something. But today it's turned into a very almost political motif, right? It allows people to voice their thoughts anonymously concerning the government, concerning politics. I think it's wonderful, and Rome is pretty much the only city in which I know art being used in this way as a form of communication, if you will. So there we are, a few of my favorite works of art. Hopefully this provoked you maybe a little bit. It gave you a sense of how you can think about art, how you can look at art, and maybe it's even provoked some questions that you might have for me today. So I'll pass back to you, Greg. Yeah.
Wow, thanks, Tatyana. That was absolutely fascinating. The detail and the meaning of some of the art. It really is incredible. Now is the time. Yes, just thanks, Tati.
Yep.
Now is the time. Please type your questions into the chat, or by all means, please put up your virtual hand and we can put you straight on to ask a question yourself. And in fact, we have Mike who's already put his hand up. Mike, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much, Greg. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Tatyana, thank you very much for what was an absolutely fascinating and engaging presentation. I was at King's many years ago in the late 60s, early 70s, and my recollection is that there was very little art history in those days. We had plenty of music. Otherwise, the school was, I think I'm fair in saying, fairly Philistine, fairly sporting. And we had a very good art teacher, I think she's called Muriel Mallows, fine painter, head of the art department. So I'm not belittling her contribution, but my point is that careers advice in those days was absolutely embryonic. One did what one was good at. Likewise at A-level, likewise at university, very few of us were encouraged to take a longer term view. And, there's the basis for a comment there on the choices given to us at school and how indeed education works as a whole. As it happens, I have had 3 different careers of about 15 years each. The first in music, the second in architectural history, and the third now in theology. And none of those have anything to do with the French and German A-levels I did at school. And indeed, the open scholarship I got to Magdalen College, Cambridge in those 2 subjects. My feeling, I'm not knocking it, but my feeling is that the school in those days just wanted to maximize its assets and didn't encourage us to think about our careers at all. And I'm delighted to see you doing something that I would have loved to do myself.
Oh. Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Well, I'm glad that I can, that I have the opportunity to talk about art history. I think, as you rightly said, it's perhaps quite a new subject, or even to this day, I don't think it's rightly promoted enough, or I don't think enough people really truly understand what it entails to study art history or to be an art historian. So I'm truly privileged to be able to share it with you and everybody else as well, and to show you that it is actually a subject that has endless possibilities of study, right? So studying it itself is enjoyable, and you're always looking at beautiful works of art or shocking works of art or even disturbing works of art. But then the skills that you can use in all aspects of life. So there's a lot of research that goes into it, a lot of speaking as well. If you have to present your case on a work of art, then you have to give a full presentation. And again, the skill of looking closely, I think, is probably the biggest takeaway I will take from art history.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. Look, Mike, thanks so much for transforming us back into your time at King's, and it has changed a lot. And actually, you're right. The encouragement of all areas is very much there for all the pupils, whatever their interests lie. It's not very pigeonholed, as you sort of try to explain there. Thank you,
Greg. I would just add, if I may, that of course, irrespective of the school curriculum, the very fact of being in the cathedral precincts beside this wonderful architecture, it got under one's skin, whether one wanted it to or not. And so it stayed with me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mike. And the cathedral is such a central and important part of the school. And thank you for your contribution. Right. Okay. So the first written question we have in there now is, what's your definition of art, Tatyana? Is there any boundary to it?
That's a very good question. It's a question that we still struggle with today as art historians. If I had to try and give a definition, I would say that art is any form of expression, right? I think that that's what it is. And then within that expression, there are so many aspects to it, right? That expression can be political, it can be personal, it can be psychological, right? It can just be an artist sort of allowing themselves to creatively expel internal demons. But then it can also be an expression with a very particular motive, as I said, political or as a form of power. Art started off as a mode of influencing people's thoughts, right? If you think of back in antiquity and back in the Middle Ages, we didn't have any form of internet communication, media, all that kind of visual things that we're so attached to today. It's part of our everyday life. So you have to try and sort of disconnect yourself from internet and imagine just having art as your only visual mode of communicating. And so it was incredibly powerful. And during the Florentine Renaissance, it was pretty much the most powerful way to influence one's thoughts. So I would say it's a very broad definition, I know, but I think just any form of expression, whatever form that may come in, if it's a painting, sculpture, even I consider poetry to be art as well, right? Because it's still a form of expression, dance, performance art, music. I think that falls very broadly under the word art.
Thanks, Tatyana. I have another question here about, obviously very inspiring about your art. Sort of, what inspired you to start making vlogs about your art?
Wow, right. Well, I think I partly answered this perhaps, but I think that art history is such a wonderful subject, and people are sometimes intimidated by it, or they don't understand too much of it to realize that it's actually a very accessible subject, right? What we're doing is essentially just talking about art. And there isn't necessarily a right or wrong when it comes to talking about art, because you're just thinking about paintings and the way that they impact you or what effect they might have on you. And it is quite subjective in that sense. So part of my aim was just, starting vlogs in order to allow people to start talking about art more freely, to make it more accessible to the wider general public. I know even, for example, friends who are intimidated to go inside museums because they think that it's just not for them. But I'm trying to show that museums can be fun, to everyone. There's always something that you will find in there that's going to catch your eye or shock you. And I also want to show that art history is really such a human subject, right? It allows us to discover more about ourselves just purely by looking at works of art. So hopefully that's what I will achieve through these vlogs. I also really love movie making. That's another passion of mine. So combining the research and the talking with my own editing and creating something visual, that's partly what inspired me as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tatyana. And it's good that Hubert's written in, an old art history teacher here at King's up to 2002, thanking you for the talk and discussing the Baroque architecture and the dome. It's an amazing painting, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It really is. So I'm keen to go back Rome just to see that dome, actually.
Please do go. Yeah, it's really worth seeing. Yeah. Sometimes when I do tours inside there, I overhear people gasping when I talk about the dome. They're just there. They don't even think that it could be fake. But once they hear me talking about it, then their minds are blown. So please go visit it. Yeah, absolutely.
Our next question is, Adrian's asking, do you find puzzles to decipher in abstract art or just in representational art?
I think abstract art is always a little bit harder when it comes to deciphering it, just because we don't have as many written sources in the same way that you would with Renaissance art or Baroque art, right? Back then, they were sort of writing more things down. When it comes to abstract art, it's more about personal expression. And sometimes even if you interview an artist and they tell you what they intended with the painting, it's usually not going to be the case. You cannot, as an art historian, always trust what the artist is saying. You have to allow for your own interpretation to play through as well, and perhaps look at their other works of art and see if you can find a common ground. So I think when it comes to abstract art, yes, we hope to use the same concept of, deciphering, but it can be a little trickier. And I think one way to go about it is to look at the artist's grander oeuvre, right? All the paintings that they've made, and see if you can draw commonalities or see where they have changed something and why. But most of the time, they're going to have something in common with all of their paintings, right? Either some sort of representation or the technique that they use, or colors that they use, or something like that.
Okay. Do you find, and this is not on the questions here, so I'm ad-libbing here. Do you find when you look at some of this artwork from the 16th, 17th century that actually you look for things, and it's a beautiful piece of art, but actually there's nothing to decipher? Like, I know they've always, or generally speaking, where those artists always had their little marks that they put on there. Was that always just a case of how art was, I suppose, produced in that era?
That's a very good question. I think that there is always something to discover with works of art, which is why this subject is so fun. And at the beginning, you might not see anything, right? It took me a while to get to where I was with my master's. That was like a full year of decoding and puzzling and searching and researching. But there will always be something. Art is always influenced by something that came prior to it, right? Either it's copying it or modifying it, or it's reacting completely to it, right? So we always have some sort of reference that we can look to. Even when it comes to modern art, what we're studying is how it differs to the art that came prior to it, right? And what's changing, and why has that changed influenced art in this way? So I think there's always something to say, particularly with Florentine and Baroque art. Rome in particular was very Catholic religious back then. We still are today. Religion plays a big part in the art. That was one of the ways in which you would, share the theology and teach the theology. So no matter what, there will be something that you can uncover. Absolutely. I stand by that.
and has that changed over the eras? Like, as you get to the more modern era, is it still similar, or is it actually is it still just, is it changed a lot?
Well, art has changed significantly over the eras, right? So it started off pretty much in the Middle Ages, for example. There was no such thing as an artist. All you had were people who were told to execute works of art, but they weren't called artists. They didn't have that social standing. The artist himself was born in the Renaissance, right? So Raphael, Michelangelo, those were the first artists as such. They had that social standing, and they were starting to, become famous and have a name. And then later on in the Baroque, and later on that sort of continued. And then things changed once again in modern times. It's artists have so much more creative freedom right now, right? Yeah. So in the Renaissance, in the Baroque, it was all, the patrons had such a big say in what was going in the works of art. So you would have somebody who would commission a work of art. Let's say a pope would ask, for example, Bernini to create this artwork, and he would say, I wanted to show this and this and this, and I wanted to create this message, and I wanted to influence people in this way. But with abstract art, you don't have anybody directing you. It's all about the artist and their own sense of expression. So that's why art tends to be a lot harder to decipher now, because it's much more subjective.
I understand. Thank you. Okay, so Janet, from Head of Classics, has written, how young can someone be to be considered an art historian?
There's no limit. I mean, as long as you've studied art history, and if you enjoy deciphering paintings, then you're good to go. You're an art historian. I mean, the more proper definition, I should say, is when you've actually published something, right, on a work of art, then you're considered an art historian. But, if I call myself an art historian, of course I have published, but I call it more, not because I publish, but because I enjoy deciphering artworks. For me, that's what I would call an art historian. So if you have the passion, if you are researching works of art, if you're reading about them, talking about them, writing about them, even if it's not, professionally, then you are an art historian at heart.
So just going on from that, so you've got a degree in art history. Sort of, what does that potentially lead into in terms of jobs? I mean, at the moment, you're doing some tour guiding around Rome, which actually is probably a real passion for you, because you can tell the story to people and bring it to life. Sure. But what sort of other jobs can that potentially lead to?
So I get this question a lot, and it can lead to so much. I said prior that the skills that you learn with art history can be applied in so many fields and aspects of life. But even within the tighter genre of art history, there are so many possibilities. You can become an art dealer, an art consultant. You can become a curator and work directly with artists. You could become an art evaluator. You can go into research, become a professor. You can work in art journalism, which is what I'm hopefully aiming towards. So you can, present or interview artists or visit museums and make videos about it, and just be an art critic also. That's quite similar. So many fields of possibility when it comes to finding a job. I'm also working as an art consultant as well, and that is such a liberating job. I have a lot of time around that, because what I'm essentially doing is I'm just communicating with galleries. I'm like the middleman between the company and galleries. So you also get to meet people, you get to reach out to people. You can do a lot of these jobs at the same time as well, which is great.
And James just written in, obviously, clearly inspired by what you've already been showing in terms of the videos, and that's on your YouTube channel, and also what you've been talking about tonight. Sort of, are you thinking about writing a book?
Oh, well, that is one of my aims for sure. Perhaps not now, but in the future, I would love to publish a book on something, in the field of art history. Yes.
And let's slightly move tack towards, you're looking at a PhD, or you're currently researching for it. Have you started it, or are you actually going to start it soon? You're just working out what you'd like to start?
Yeah, I'm currently researching. So for a PhD, you have to have a lot of research done before you actually apply, because you're going to be presenting a case, and they have to feel safe that you're going to actually do something with what you're presenting. So right now I'm researching Armenian art. What I'm planning to do, what my aim is to research how the Armenian genocide impacted the art of Armenians. I think it does have a massive effect on on their imagery, let's say. I know that there is a link for sure. I am part Armenian, so my mother is half Armenian. And I've spoken with Armenian artists, so a good friend of our family, Sarkis Hamadasyan, who I have a video on as well on my YouTube channel. He's an Armenian artist, and in so many of his paintings, I noticed this sense of confusion, or there are all these sources coming from all over the place. And I think that sense of chaos, of confusion, can be linked to the chaos caused by the Armenian genocide. And he has said, in his own writings, that of course that is an intrinsic part of his work. It comes through organically in anything that he creates. So yeah.
Fantastic. Again, from Janet, sort of, I suppose, just in terms of the age of the piece of art, when does something attract the interest of an art historian? So, which is, I think, a fascinating question, actually, because does something that was created last year attract an interest, or actually is it only many generations later that all of a sudden they look at those pieces of art?
That's a very good question as well. I think that art that has been around for a lot of years, for hundreds of years, is always easier to decipher, or perhaps more exciting, because you tend to have a lot more sources. So perhaps, the older the art, the more exciting. But then it's completely subjective once more. I mean, if you're an Armenian artist that produced a painting a year ago, I would personally be interested to examine that and perhaps ask him, what's going on here? What are your influences? What's your inspiration? Why are you portraying this in that way? So I don't think there's any particular definite answer that I can give you. I think it's more subjective as well. And any artwork produced at any stage, any day, even performance art today, there's so much that you can say about it. And there's so much freedom of interpretation as well, and so many ways in which you can approach art. It's not necessarily about digging up concrete clues. You can just, for example, study how it affects its audience today, or the impact that it could have on a future audience.
Is there any, and just on that, and Janet touches on in another part to a question, in lockdown, because there would have been other eras where people would have been quite heavily locked down. I'd imagine that it could have produced some quite almost dark pieces of work. Is there any indication what the last 12 months might produce in terms of art because of the lockdown, due to looking at history of art in the past?
That's a wonderful question, and I'm sure that it will produce some maybe dark and perhaps a little bit works of art that maybe comment on isolation, perhaps. I want to draw maybe a parallel to a work of art that was produced in the past. Francisco Goya, who was a Spanish artist, This is also on my YouTube channel if you want to check it out. But at some stage of his life, after witnessing war, after going through illness, he ended up turning deaf for a mysterious reason. He isolated himself in this small home in Madrid. And while he was isolated by himself, he created murals, and he essentially decorated the whole of the interior home with these really, really disturbing works of art. I want to show you one in particular. I'm just going to search it up now, just to give you a sense of what isolation could produce, right? Yeah. Potentially. Perhaps you've seen this painting. It's one of, well, it's known as one of the scariest paintings of art history. Just give me one more second. Here we go. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen again, if possible. So here you go, Saturn devouring his son, right? So this was produced while Goya was in isolation. And what it is a mythological god eating his own son limb by limb. And, you know, artists have said, well, maybe Goya was just having a little bit of fun, but I undeniably think that this was an effect of being isolated by himself after having witnessed war and illness and, you know, struggle. So maybe that's perhaps an answer to your question. I don't know if people will be making things like this, but it can show you how, you know, our experiences can affect our art as well.
Yes, he was a very dark artist, wasn't he, Goya? Am I right in saying a lot of his works are shown in Madrid, in some of the in Madrid in the art galleries there? Is that right?
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. But the interesting thing is he started off completely different. So in the beginning, when he was first being commissioned, he was painting these very happy tapestries of, you know, little children frolicking around on swings, the sun shining. But then afterwards, after witnessing war, after going through this period of isolation, this was the result. So it really shows you how you can really change, you know, depending on your experiences. I think this is a prime example, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. Mike wants to ask another question. I'll bring Mike back on. Go on, Mike.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay, I hope?
Yes, absolutely. Please.
Yeah, just a quickie in conclusion for Tatyana. Tatyana, do you have favorite art historians? I know that's a loaded question. I'll kick it off with my own. I love reading T.J. Clarke in the London Review of Books. How about you?
Wow, that's a really good question. Yeah, that's a very difficult question, to be honest with you. I think the fun of being an art historian is reading all these different interpretations. So I wouldn't settle on one art historian in particular. I think that it depends on the work of art that you're looking at as well, because, you know, art historians tend to sort of specialize in different areas of study. I love the work of Bernini, and I have to say that a number of art historians, I'm struggling to remember her name now, but a female art historian who really presented a strong argument, and she was essentially arguing that Bernini's art is all about the art of theater, which I strongly agree with, because Bernini himself was involved in theater. He was a screenplay artist, he was directing plays, he was a scenographer as well, and she argues that that's intrinsic to his work. That's what's allowing him to create these interactive sculptures. So I can't remember her name, but I think she would be my favorite for now. Yeah. But otherwise, I love looking at different interpretations. I think that there is no right or wrong, perhaps, and seeing art historians taking such different approach in their research and in their arguments is really what makes this subject what it is. It's
sure.
So fruitful.
Absolutely.
So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mark. Just a last question for you, Tatyana. Sort of, you touched on what you'd like to do in the future, and we said before. I said, where would you like to do your PhD? And before we started the presentation, you said, oh, you know, it's almost the world is yours. Do you want to go to America, or do you want to go somewhere else in Europe, etc. So, what do you see yourself doing in the future? You also touched on some of the other areas before in one of your other answers. What can you just sort of, I suppose, give a bit more concrete to that?
Sure, thank you. Well, I still love deciphering works of art. So I think in the immediate future, my aim is to complete the PhD in Armenian art and hopefully leave my mark there. I know that it's an area that hasn't been greatly studied yet, which is why I'm so excited to start delving and start interviewing Armenian artists as well. But more broadly speaking, in the future, I would love to keep operating in the art world. I do love presenting and talking about art. So I will perhaps try to go into art journalism. I think that would be really fun. Anything that would allow me to sort of keep commenting on art, keep talking about it, keep making it accessible, while still, you know, researching at the same time. So you might see me in arts journalism. Let's hope.
Fantastic. Tatyana, actually, we've had one more question. I'm quite keen to ask this one, actually. In the past, art was put into clear categories. You had the medieval, Gothic, but now there's so many different diversity in art. Do you think there'll be once again appear some clear style of art of a time period? Or is it we have it, or we just don't realize it?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part of the question?
The last part is, do you think there will be once again appear some clear style of art of a time period?
Okay, yeah.
Or is it we have it and we just don't realize it?
I think that we probably have it right now, and it will be defined by future art historians. But all these labels that we have, just to sort of, it's hard to realize that these are constructs that we as art historians have imposed on works of art. So people in the Renaissance were not going, I'm going to make a Renaissance work of art right now. People during the Baroque were not saying, you know, this painting is Baroque in style, right? It's the same as you go through. These are labels, categories that we've imposed on works of art, just in order to make it easier to categorize them. So absolutely, right now, there's probably something going on that we can't define right now. I think our definition is probably just modern, contemporary art, right? Because it's happening now. But perhaps in a few hundred years, people will look back and say, well, this was going through this phase.
Yeah. Fantastic. Look, Tatyana, thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating talk. Wonderful presentation. I've learned a lot. There's no doubt. In a short space of time, you're a great teacher. And you know, I just want to reiterate a couple of the points you made. The art history, the study of humanity through visual stories. And I didn't really get that when you said that until you actually went through and showed us the visual storage. It would be a bit like picking up a book from that era and reading about it. It's shown in the artwork itself. So thank you so much for bringing attention to the cleverness of the art, particularly from the eras and those particular works that you showed us. It truly has enriched our evening. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And I hope, as you said, that you took something away from the talk.
Absolutely. Look, thank you very much, Tatyana. On behalf of everyone at King's, please, next time you're here, please come back and visit us again. I know you were here recently, having siblings, having just gone through. So please come back and visit us, and hopefully maybe give a talk in person, which would be absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you soon in the next King Talk. Have a good night. Thank you.